Hey, welcome back, Fantasy Fiction Fanatics, to another mini lesson. I just uploaded the full-length class of plot and plot development and things like that for our first writing episode. And I just thought I would go ahead and condense the main plot development ideas that I discussed in this class as a mini episode. Now, as I said in the actual lesson, I am going to be going into more depth and coming back to this topic. This is kind of a broad overview and just things that are elements that are important to have into it. And of course, any questions and concerns you can always comment below and ask me about. But I do plan to go in more in depth to it as well. So if some of it seems a bit confusing or a bit rushed or not enough details or whatever else, those will be coming soon. But again, if you want to know right away, go ahead and just go into the comment boxes and ask me. Alright, let's go ahead and get into our mini lesson for the day, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Let's get watching. Alright, so let's go ahead and move on to the next topic, which is how to develop plot. We're going to cover it in both the main overarching plot, as well as the basics of like the specific events and that kind of plot building. So the first thing with developing an overarching plot line is to decide what kind of fantasy you're going to be writing. You can either do a high fantasy, which is a complete new and developed fantasy world that you create, or you're going to do an urban fantasy where it takes place in our world, and you are adding fantasy elements to it and kind of changing the history of this world. Because depending on what kind of fantasy world you're going to do, it's going to change what kind of plots are available to you. If you're going to do a whole new fantasy world and very high fantasy stuff, it is not unlikely. I mean, it is not impossible, depending on what kind of story you're doing, what kind of world you've created. But it is less likely to have things like guns and big cities that are the same kind as in our world. So those kind of plots that might apply to something that happens in our world would not apply to this fantasy world that you've created. Again, it's not stuck in stone depending on what kind of world you've created. Maybe it is a world that has similar qualities. But more than likely, if you're going to do something that would happen in our world just with fantasy elements, it's going to be more of the urban fantasy. And that's going to have its own types of things that you are going to have for plots as well. The plot's going to fit what kind of world you've created and what you're doing with that world and what you expect to happen in that world. So first you must decide what kind of genre, what kind of style of the fantasy genre you're doing. High fantasy or urban fantasy. And then then from there you're going to have deciding what your plot is going to be. Now for this next kind of development with this plot, I am going to have to give credit to the book I discussed, because it kind of got me thinking of this type of notion and this kind of plot development because of reading that book. So if you want to go ahead and see how Deborah talks about it and things like that, I do recommend the plot portion because it is really, really helpful. And so it is a little bit based on this. It's not the exact same, but it is developed because I read this book. So I do want to go ahead and give her credit for that. But the way the plot will be developed for the overarching story is, what is the basic notion of your story? That's what you have to start with for this plot. The plot is this goal and what kind of obstacles you're going to have because of the goal. Because obviously there is no storyline, or not a very good story is what I'm trying to say, if you can get to A to B and there's no problems. You're like, okay, making a very simple, not story-like goal, but like say you're saying, I'm going to go to the store, and the person can just drive to the store and go shopping. Then there is no real story that's going to be able to have any depth to it or any length to it. or very many people interested because, okay, this person went to the store and they went shopping. What's the big deal? There is no real conflict or any problems that they're facing to get to this goal. And the whole point, a lot of times, of fantasy and many other books is the problems we face toward getting that goal. We want them to reach the goal, but we don't know if they're going to make it. And that's what makes it interesting and fun, and us wanting to continue to read more about it. That's why a lot of times there are cliffhangers and chapters that end in bad places, because that way you keep turning the page. So I have some examples here, some more common examples, as well as some from our reading of Dragonlance. But I've got these two examples. One, they're both kind of urban fantasies. I didn't really pick a high fantasy one for this one because I wanted to try and make references to books that are well known, so that way most people would be able to catch these examples. But if we go ahead and start with Harry Potter Book 1. Now, there is a difference between an overarching plot between a series of books and an overarching part of one book. So I'm just discussing one book. Book 1's overarching storyline is that Harry wants to go to this wizarding school and get away from the Dursleys and all that and have a good time and be happy at this school. But because of Voldemort and the Sorcerer's Stone, that is interrupting his year, and it being a good, easy year to get away from the Dursleys. Okay, another example is Twilight, Book 1. Again, like I said, I know these are series, but we're talking about just the one book. What is the point between point A, the first page of the book, to the last page of that particular book? Bella moves to Forks and wants to live an easy life, blending in, not being the center of attention, and just go along, live with Charlie to make her mom happy. But because she falls in love with a vampire and is hunted down, she ends up being hunted down by James and can't just live her easy life blending into the background. So we have that goal in mind, and we've got this reason why it's not happening. And that does not mean that with the overarching plot, that B is always going to be exactly what you wanted B to be in the beginning. So in the beginning, Bella's goal is to have an easy life and not blend in. She ends up getting hunted down by James, but that does not mean at B that she has that easy life. And sometimes that is the end goal, and it is reached, and sometimes it's not. But there is always the plan to get there and why it hasn't happened, and then whatever that B ends up being is because of why it didn't happen. Does that make any sense? I know I kind of threw that wrench in there a little bit as we were discussing the plot, kind of also talking about how you don't always get to B. But right now I just wanted to show how we're getting the A to B and why it's not happening throughout the book. And yes, like I said, sometimes we get to the B as originally planned, or sometimes the B ends up getting to the B in a different way than we expected. So in a way, Bella does get to be the easy life that she wanted to, and she does get to end up having the kind of blending into the background, not as much as she originally wanted to, but she ends up getting to that easy life after James is defeated. She goes to prom and does like her normal things just with Edward by her side at that point. So again, let's just do one more recap. We've got A to B and the reason why A cannot just be going to B so easily. What kind of conflict is there going to be for the story, the main portion of the conflict for that story? That is how you must develop your overarching plot. What exactly do you want to have happen? And do you want them to reach point B? Or are they not going to reach point B until the end of a series? So that's why I'm saying with certain books we might not reach the B, or the B might be reached indifferently, because that is the beginning of this story, but it is not the end of the series, which incorporates the bigger story. So you kind of have to pick and choose on what you're going to do. If you do a series, the overarching B might seem like it starts at point A and wants to be at the end of point B, and point B is not reached until later, and maybe it's reached at the end of that the story, and you decide to start from a new point A and go to a new point B. It's all up to choice, and we will go ahead and talk about those kind of more developed plot elements at a later date. We'll go ahead and talk about like things like subplots and plots between series and things like that, but I just want us to give it the basic notion of plot right now. Alright, so let's go ahead and talk about plot and development of it for this tinier events. The event that lead up to the point B. So these are important because they are the moments that flow together to make the story, like I have mentioned before. And so each event has to have some kind of purpose. So these kind of little tiny plots are important to have a purpose, and so they are built a bit differently. I've got my little notes here that I'm going to go ahead and bring a little bit closer to me just so I don't miss anything I wanted to say to you. So here are my list of the different elements that I believe these little mini plots should either employ or need in them, or most of needs to be in there. Something that these are the important parts of the mini plots, on what purpose they are given and how they help move the overarching plot forward. So each event should have a purpose of some kind, like I had just said. This purpose should move the plot forward. Most of them should move the plot forward. That doesn't mean every single one has to move the main overarching plot forward, but it should be the majority of them should. They should develop characters. Just like when we're reading Dragonlance, most of these little tiny events develop the characters because we see how they react, we see how they deal with stress. They do all these different things that I've talked about in other episodes talking about the book. So most of them should develop the characters. We should also be developing the world, because the only way we can portray the world to our audience, because it is one that is not a normal world that we live in and expect the norms to be that case, each of these events must develop the world as well. That's the way we can portray little by little to the audience what kind of world we're in. We need to flow from one to the next. Let me go ahead and expand on that. We need to have a sense of motivation or reason. Why or how does one event lead to the next? For example, like I was talking about earlier with Dragonlance, the one event with them running away because they were caught with the staff then leads to the fact that they need to escape in the boat, which then leads to them hiding in that cave. And then they all talk and they realize that they need to go ahead and learn more about this staff because the people are after it, so that leads them to the next step, and the next event, and the next event upon that. They flow together one after another. And then the last one is going to be events can be considered chapters or a section with a break. Now, obviously, not every single section is going to be, every single event is not going to be sectioned off as a section break or at the end of a chapter. For example, some chapters have a couple of events in them, but depending on how you want to break them up or how you want to emphasize certain events, you can do that, either section it off with a break or at the end of a chapter. Or if you believe that every single event needs to be framed, depending on how your story is going and how the flow between each one goes to the next one, it might be advantageous to have these chapter breaks. For example, if we go ahead and talk about the Dragonlance one, it seems that a lot of the events, not all of them, but a lot of them do fit kind of in those chapters, or they do sometimes have those section breaks in there to emphasize and frame the different events that they find are the important ones to take into notice. So that was kind of a lot to go ahead and put into this one little section, as that's a lot to be put in there, but this is the each main purpose of events needs to have these kind of elements, because that is the bulk of your story. Each event then leads to the next event and leads to the next event, and that is what your story consists of, is all these events put together to make this one overarching plot, which is why then you must move the plot forward, and you must develop your characters, and you must then develop the world and all these other things, is because these are the actual things that matter. These are the points that your reader will read. Without these events, without it moving the plot along, as well as these other elements, you will never get these other elements, because this is the actual story, is these events put together. If that makes any sense. Go ahead and comment below if you have any questions on what I am discussing right now. I know that I'm still a little bit figuring out how the best way to teach these things are and these ideas are. So any questions, anything that you don't understand, or anything that you want added explanation on, please go ahead and comment down below. All right, so